Deep in France's medieval war-torn history is a single figure who stands out as a symbol of French pride, a young peasant girl with no education who would rise to fight at the head of an army and speak with a king, Joan of Arc. This video looks at her life and attempts to disentangle the legend and myths of her life from the real Joan. Joan was born in January 1412 in the hamlet of Domremy, a cluster of around 36 stone and thatch houses hugging the upper Meuse River in what is now the Vosges. In her lifetime, the village sat inside the Duchy of Bar, a loyalist pocket technically under the French crown, yet bordered on 3 sides by Anglo-Burgundian territory. Although idyllic in appearance, apple orchards, communal grazing land, a single-nave parish church, Domremy lay on a military fault line. Burgundian foragers and English chevauchés crisscrossed the region. Oral tradition remembered a recent raid that burned nearby Maxey-sur-Meuse. The 100 Years' War was woven into village consciousness long before Joan could ride a horse. Her parents, Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romay, were tenant farmers of the upper peasant class. Manorial rolls and later inquest testimony put the family's holdings at roughly 50 to 60 acres. Enough to keep draft animals, hire day labour at harvest, and pay the annual cens to their seigneur, the Lord of Bourg-le-Mont. Jacques also served intermittently as village doyen, or chief, collecting taxes and organising watch duty, roles that gave Joan early glimpses of local governance. No evidence suggests the family ever slipped into destitution. Indeed, Joan later testified she knew not the meaning of need. Domremy's social calendar revolved around the liturgical year. Children processed behind relics on rogation days, and villagers hiked 3 miles to the shrine of Notre-Dame de Bermond for Marian feasts. Joan absorbed this atmosphere of rustic piety. She never learned to read or write, normal for girls outside towns, but could recite the Pater Noster, Ave, and Credo flawlessly, evidence of catechism by the parish priest, Father Guillaume Front. Chores were gender-typical, spinning, sewing, tending livestock, yet neighbours recalled that even while minding sheep, she would slip away to pray in the tiny Beaumont chapel, sometimes leaving her flock in a friend's charge. At the rehabilitation trial of 1456, 19 villagers testified about Joan's youth. The composite portrait is remarkably consistent. She was good, straightforward, kind, and so industrious that her hands were never idle. She gave alms from her own bread, nursed sick neighbours and, according to one witness, wept when soldiers cursed God's name. These traits, unremarkable in isolation, became the bedrock of her later credibility. When the teenager announced a divine mission in 1428, the villagers who had seen her piety and compassion from childhood were the first to believe her. Having said this, while there is no reason to doubt the truth of these statements, it is possible in light of the reason for these testimonies that her friends and neighbours absolutely played up the element of Joan being a good, devout Christian. Joan was 13 when, by her account, a light brighter than noon flooded her father's garden, and the archangel Michael spoke, "Guard your chastity and deliver France." Within months, 2 martyrs she knew only from church frescoes, Catherine of Alexandria and Margaret of Antioch, joined the visitations. The voices never contradicted each other and soon settled into a rhythm. 2 or 3 times a week, they repeated the same blunt agenda. Joan told no one outside her confessor, fearing mockery, but she began to slip more often to the tiny chapel of Notre-Dame de Bermond to pray and weep for the realm of France. Medieval witnesses accepted these visitations as supernatural. Modern scholars offer a spectrum of possibilities, from sincere mystical experience to migraine auras, temporal lobe epilepsy, or simply a culturally acceptable framework for a teenager's patriotism and desire for autonomy. Nothing in the sources proves or disproves any one explanation, so we can only interpret these events as Joan understood them, but we can keep an open mind about what the visions may or may not have been. Whatever the real reason, it still came down to the same purpose. Joan said she had been given a clear set of orders. Firstly, to break the English siege of Orléans, gateway to the Loire, then to lead Charles, Dauphin of France, to Reims for sacred anointing, and finally, to expel the English entirely from France. Even a seasoned captain might have judged the list ambitious. For a teenage peasant girl, it bordered on the impossible. Yet militarily, it was perfectly logical. Save Orleans to halt English momentum and crown the king to unite wavering French factions. At 16, Joan began pressing her parents to let her visit the Dauphin. Jacques d'Arc refused and, following village custom, negotiated an engagement for her. Joan answered with an outright vow of perpetual virginity, invoking the saint's command. The spurned suitor sued in the episcopal court at Toul. Joan appeared in person, testified she had never consented, and the judge annulled the match. A stunning legal victory for an illiterate farm girl. Her family, if unconvinced, at least saw that the ordinary channels could not blunt her resolve. Determined to reach the Dauphin's court, Joan set out on foot for Vaucouleurs, the nearest loyalist garrison, and demanded an audience with its commander, Captain Robert de Baudricourt. In May 1428, he dismissed the slight teenage girl as a harmless oddity and laughed her out of the hall. Undeterred, she reappeared in July, and this time, sympathetic townspeople offered to equip her, yet Baudricourt still refused to back what he called a child's folly. She returned a third time in January 1429, steel-eyed and prophetic, declaring that a recent French setback near Orleans would be reversed before mid-Lent. When messengers soon confirmed that the lost outpost of Saint-Pierre-le-Moutier had indeed been retaken, the captain's skepticism cracked. He decided it was safer to aid a girl who might be favoured, as seen through medieval eyes, by God. He supplied her with a horse, a sword, men's riding clothes for disguise, and a 6-man escort, provided she accepted full peril for the journey ahead. On the icy morning of the 6th of February 1429, Joan crossed the city gate wearing a dark tunic, hose, and thigh-high boots. The party threaded 450 kilometers of hostile terrain, night rides, forded rivers, and twice passed themselves off as Burgundian patrols. On the 13th of February, they reached the fortress of Chinon, where the Dauphin kept a nervous court. For Charles and his advisors, the arrival was equal parts embarrassment and opportunity. An illiterate adolescent claiming angelic strategy smacked of desperation, yet her confidence, hardened by the road and the courtroom at Toul, was infectious. France's fortunes were at their nadir. Perhaps, the courtiers reasoned, God had chosen an unlikely vessel before. At the minimum, it was political theatre. Joan's private visions were about to become a very public campaign. Joan's arrival at Chinon on the 13th of February 1429 caused a stir. The Dauphin, fearful of assassination, had hidden himself among courtiers. The test was simple. If this peasant really enjoyed supernatural insight, she would pick him out. Joan walked past embroidered sleeves and gilt scabbards, fell to one knee before the man in plainest clothes, and greeted him as Gentil Dauphin. Witnesses later swore that Charles went white. After a private conversation, Joan was dispatched to Poitiers for doctrinal vetting. For 3 interminable weeks, theologians peppered her with questions about free will, angelology, and the Church's authority. She answered with rustic frankness, "I know nothing of letters, but I come in God's name. He will send me to Orleans." Unable to refute her orthodoxy, the examiners declared nothing improper has been found and advised the king to test her on the battlefield. Back at Chinon in late March, armourers measured her for a white steel suit and farriers chose the tallest warhorse in the royal stables, both financed by the cash-strapped court out of sheer desperation. Joan designed her own banner, a field of linen sprinkled with fleur-de-lis, bearing the names Jesus Maria, Christ enthroned, and kneeling angels. On the 27th of April, she rode out at the head of a ragtag relief column, 2,500 spearmen, a few hundred Scots archers, and wagon loads of salted fish. They were nominally commanded by the veteran La Hire, but in practice, electrified by the presence of La Pucelle, the maid, Joan's new nickname. When Joan reached the city on the night of the 29th of April, the English had tightened a 7-month stranglehold, ringed by earthwork bastilles south of the Loire. She entered through the Burgundy gate with her banner streaming and the bells of Sainte-Croix pealing. Chroniclers noted women crowded windows crying, "She is sent by God." If nothing else, it was clear that even at this early stage, the image of Joan was being used as a symbol of hope for France against the English. Joan insisted on immediate action. On the 4th of May, she led a dawn sortie against the Bastille of Saint-Lô. An arrow struck her shoulder. She withdrew long enough for the point to be cut out, then remounted, banner in hand, and rallied the wavering assault. The English garrison collapsed by noon. 2 days later, she ordered simultaneous strikes on the twin forts guarding the Tourelle Bridge. Fighting waist-deep in a dry moat, she was knocked from a scaling ladder by a stone, armour dented, seized the banner once more, and, exactly as dusk settled, French troops flooded the rampart. When the Tourelles fell on 8th May 1429, the English south bank positions became untenable, and their commanders withdrew. Orléans, thought doomed, was now free, just as Joan had said it would. Overnight, she became a propaganda sensation. Balladeers rhymed her exploits. Scribes copied eyewitness letters that raced north to Paris and south to Avignon. But Joan refused to rest, ignoring all celebrations in Orléans. With the city safe, she pressed the Dauphin to strike again before the English could knit their shattered ring of bastilles back together. A lean field army of perhaps 6,000 men mustered in early June and set off eastward along the Loire, a lightning march that posterity would label the Loire Valley campaign. The first test came at Jargeau on the 12th of June 1429. French guns under Jean de Brosse punched a gap in the masonry. Joan apparently spurred her horse over the tumble of stone and shouted, "Forward! They are ours!" Her banner topped the breach while English defenders still hesitated, and by sunset, the tricolour of Orléans fluttered over the town. 3 days later, outside Meung-sur-Loire, she ignored the hill-crowned castle altogether, driving instead at the bridge that locked English communications north and south of the river. While much of this is presented purely as Joan's ruthless and bold decisions, she lacked military training, and it's likely the plans of attack were a combination of Joan's intuition and certainty, and the strategy and advice of the military commanders around her. There's still much historical debate over how much autonomy Joan was really given. Either way, when the plank roadway fell intact, the garrison was stranded, its relief columns forced to circle miles upstream. On the 17th of June, Beaugency capitulated almost bloodlessly after brief parleys, handing Joan another vital crossing together with a storehouse of grain and arrows the French sorely needed. Alarmed, the English command hurried veterans John Talbot and Sir John Fastolf south to plug the breach. Joan rode out to meet them, drawing their columns onto the flat meadows near the hamlet of Patay at dawn on the 18th of June. French scouts located the enemy vanguard before Talbot's archers had time to plant their defensive stakes. A thunderclap of mounted men-at-arms smashed into the unprepared line, and within an hour the English field army lay wrecked. Talbot was captured, hundreds were slain, and the survivors had to flee without formation. To chronicler Jean Chartier, Patay was to the English what Agincourt had been to the French, but in reverse. It was a single shock that upended the balance of the war and crowned the Maid's Loire whirlwind with decisive glory. Her victories whetted Joan's appetite for her second divine errand, the crowning of the Dauphin at Reims. In early July 1429, she pressed Charles to leave the relative safety of the Loire Valley and march northeast across Champagne, territory dotted with towns that owed nominal fealty to the Burgundians and could, in theory, bar the way. Charles's civilian advisors hesitated, but Joan insisted the sight of a united royal army, fresh from triumph, would make gates swing open. She was right. Gien, Auxerre and Troyes capitulated after token parleys. Châlons-en-Champagne admitted the host amid pealing bells, its townsfolk claiming they had never doubted the Maid's mission. Chroniclers marvelled that a procession of former enemy strongholds now provided food, horses and cannon, as if eager to wash themselves of English allegiance. On the morning of the 17th of July, 1429, the column reached Reims, ancient seat of French coronations. Inside the candle-lit nave of Notre Dame, Joan stood beside the high altar holding her banner. She said it had borne the burden of the day's labour and deserved the honour, while the Archbishop anointed Charles with the holy oil of Clovis. trumpets sounded, and clergy proclaimed him Charles VII, King of France. Chroniclers wrote that Joan wept for joy, murmuring to her companions that God's promise was half fulfilled. Yet, even in triumph, she urged speed. Paris, the capital, still flew the cross of St. George and the Burgundian colours. The newly crowned king hesitated again, swayed by counsellors such as Georges de la Trémoille, who favoured negotiation over fresh assault. Joan argued that hesitation would squander the shock of their success. Stuck between the logic of the advisors and the persuasion of the young girl who seemed to bring them endless victory, the court inched northward only after weeks of debate, giving the English and their Burgundian allies time to reinforce the capital. When at last the royal entourage camped outside the walls in early September, factions within Charles's entourage were already whispering about armistice terms. Joan was disgusted with what she viewed as cowardice rather than moderation, and she secured royal leave for a limited attack, hoping a bold stroke might crack Parisian morale before treaties could tie her hands. At dawn on the 8th of September 1429, the feast of the Nativity of the Virgin, she led assault parties against the Saint-Honoré gate on the city's northwest. From the ditch below the walls, she waved her banner, urging sappers to fill the moat and men-at-arms to plant scaling ladders. A crossbow quarrel pierced her thigh, knocking her to the ground. But she refused evacuation, rallying troops for several hours until nightfall. But the king, listening to cautious advisors, ordered a retreat and soon afterwards suspended offensive operations altogether. The wound healed, yet Joan's momentum was checked not by English steel but by the politics of her own court, an omen of struggles that would shadow her last months of freedom. The aborted assault on Paris left Joan restless. Through the winter of 1429 to 1430, she shadowed the royal army in a series of cold weather manoeuvres designed less to conquer than to signal that France still possessed a sword. In October, she helped capture Saint-Pierre-le-Moutier, and in November she rode against La Charité-sur-Loire, though lack of artillery forced a withdrawal. Even these modest forays kept her in the public eye, and on the 29th of December 1429, Charles VII rewarded the service by issuing letters of nobility to Joan, her parents, and her brothers. Chroniclers state she apparently accepted the parchment with a soldier's shrug, simply remarking, "God first served," and returned to the saddle. By early spring, Burgundian forces under John of Luxembourg were threatening the royalist town of Compiègne, a strategic crossing on the Oise. Joan petitioned Charles for reinforcements. The court, wary of open battle, sent only token companies. Undeterred, she galloped north with a handful of lances, gathering local levies as she went. On the 23rd of May 1430, she rode into Compiègne through the Porte de Pierrefonds and promised the townspeople they would not face the siege alone. Hours later, Burgundians gathered on the far bank. Joan ordered a sortie to disrupt their guns before they could dig in. A bridge of boats carried her contingent across the Oise at dusk. The initial charge scattered outlying pickets, but fresh Burgundian cavalry swept in behind, severing the return route. Joan held the rearguard, banner streaming in the half-light, until her horse bogged in marshy ground. Unhorsed, she refused to surrender until a Burgundian archer dragged her down by the hem of her surcoat. Witnesses heard her shout, "Yield! Yield to the Duke of Burgundy!" hoping to avoid English hands, but the distinction made little difference. Within days, John of Luxembourg had her locked in the chateau of Beaurevoir, and he then paraded his prize before Duke Philip. Neither chivalry nor ransom talk altered her captor's mind. English envoys arrived with 10,000 livres tournois, royal funds earmarked specifically to buy La Pucelle. The transaction, recorded like a livestock sale, moved rapidly, and by early November she was handed to the English and conveyed under heavy guard to Rouen, their administrative capital in Normandy. There, the long duel of skirmishes and sieges ended in a stone-walled cell. Joan, who had ridden free across war-torn France preaching deliverance, now faced bars, manacles, and the far subtler weapons of an ecclesiastical court eager to break the maid who had once broken their armies. The English government, eager to break the mystique of La Pucelle and prove her to be nothing more than a fraud, turned her over to Pierre Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais, and a committed partisan of Duke Philip of Burgundy. Cauchon convened a special ecclesiastical court in the castle of Rouen in early January 1431. 19-year-old Joan was led in chains before a panel of doctors of theology and canon law, most from the University of Paris, an institution then firmly pro-English. No advocate stood beside her. Canon law allowed but did not require counsel for the accused, and Cauchon made certain none was provided. It was already a fixed trial from the start. The court drafted 131 separate articles of accusation, later condensed to a dozen core charges, all designed to turn battlefield legend into theological menace. From the outset, the interrogations probed three fault lines. First, the authenticity of her voices. Were Michael, Catherine, and Margaret heavenly messengers or demons in disguise? Second, her persistent use of male clothing, doublet, hose, thigh-high boots and laced tunic, garments that contravened Deuteronomy's prohibition on cross-dressing and, in clerical eyes, blurred the God-ordained binaries of their world. Modern scholarship notes her outfit also buckled at the crotch, a practical safeguard against assault in prisons of the time in which men and women were mixed together. Joan herself told the court she wore it because it is safer when among men. Third, the question of obedience. Did her direct revelations place her above the authority of the church? Sessions unfolded in a dim audience chamber, clerks scratching Latin minutes, while Joan faced volleys of scholastic logic. When they asked if she believed she was in God's grace, a trap because church doctrine held no mortal could claim certainty, she answered disarmingly, "If I am not, may God place me there. If I am, may he keep me." Pressed on whether her banner was holier than other banners, she conceded that the lives of the men who fought beneath it made it precious. Queried about the Dauphin's secret sign at Chinon, she refused to expose it, saying only it concerned the good of the kingdom. If nothing else, regardless of her lack of formal education, Joan proved she was a clever and politically minded young woman against the relentless questioning. The clothing issue became a fixation. Cauchon ordered a woman's dress brought, but Joan flatly refused it, repeating that her saints commanded otherwise and that among male guards her current outfit served as armour of modesty. Modern gender historians point out that nothing in French civil statutes expressly banned women from wearing men's armour in war, but ecclesiastical courts seized on biblical literalism to criminalise the practice. Joan's persistence offered prosecutors a visible daily crime that buttressed the more abstract charge of sorcery. After 3 months of hearings, the judges drafted their verdict: obstinate heretic, blasphemer, idolater of voices, and a rebel who had abandoned the obedience of the church militant. On the 24th May 1431, they marched her to the cemetery of Saint-Ouen, where a stake and tinder stood ominously close. There, Cauchon read the sentence of death. Fatigued, half-ill, terrified, Joan understandably faltered. She signed a brief abjuration, 6 lines of cramped legal Latin she could not decipher, and even if it had been in French, she still would have been unable to read it, promising to submit to the church and renounce male attire. Eyewitnesses said she spoke so softly the clerk could barely catch the words. The court shaved her head, dressed her in a grey woman's gown, and condemned her to perpetual imprisonment on bread and water. It was a seeming mercy masking a fatal catch. Within 48 hours, her guards, English soldiers quartered in the castle keep, harassed and threatened her. She asked for her old clothes to fasten herself against assault. When they delivered the tunic and hose, she donned them at once, her immediate thoughts on keeping her person safe. Cauchon burst in with notaries. "You relapse into your errors." Joan replied that her voices had reproached her abjuration and reaffirmed God's mandate. Under canon law, relapse after recantation warranted automatic capital punishment. The judges needed no further hearings. They declared her a relapsed heretic, handing her to the secular arm for execution. Even in defeat, she flashed defiance. Asked whether she still believed her voices came from God, she said simply, "Yes, and they have never deceived me." Pressed to the end on the church's supremacy, she uttered her most famous retort: About Jesus Christ and the Church, I simply know they are just one thing, and we must not complicate the matter. For the tribunal, it was final proof of heresy. For later readers, it would ring as the steadfast faith of a teenage commander who had rattled kingdoms. The sentence of fire was set for the last morning of May, and the English quietly congratulated themselves. They had traded 10,000 livres for a scaffold, a sermon, and, so they imagined, the erasure of a legend. Dawn on the 30th of May 1431 found Rouen veiled in low river fog. Soldiers roused Joan from her cell, bound her elbows with rope, and marched her through the castle gate toward the old market square, a few hundred paces away. The English ringed the route with halberds, and townspeople lined doorways, craning for a glimpse of the woman who had once broken their siege lines. Joan asked the Dominican friar who walked beside her to carry the processional crucifix from Saint-Sauveur. She wanted its figure of Christ in her line of sight. One English archer, moved or curious, snapped 2 sticks into a crude cross and handed it to her. She clutched it beneath her shackled arms. At the square, a tall scaffold had been built. Cochon and the inquisitors sat in judgment seats, while English captains kept a wary perimeter. The friar mounted the platform, holding the church cross aloft so Joan could focus on it. She asked for holy water, then declared in a clear voice that she forgave everyone present, even you, my judges. As the executioner chained her waist to the post and piled straw around her feet, she repeated the names Jesus and Mary like a heartbeat. When the torch touched the straw, the flames leapt quickly. Her dress caught and smoke whirlpooled around her face. Witnesses said she cried, Jesus, a final time before the roar drowned human speech. Within minutes, little remained but charred timbers and a warped iron chain. To forestall any cult of relics, the English ordered the ashes swept into a cart and dumped from the Pont de la Seine, the river carrying them past the city walls she had never breached in life. It was both a disrespectful act and one that they hoped would erase her legend. Instead, by nightfall, rumours of her sanctity were already travelling upstream. Joan's ashes drifted down the Seine, but her story would not sink. As early as 1436, rumours circulated that the maid had escaped Rouen and lived in hiding. Others swore they saw a dove rise from the pyre, heaven's witness to judicial murder. The English tried to stamp out such tales, yet the harder they pressed, the more indelible her memory became. 2 decades later, France itself bore the proof. The once timorous Dauphin, now King Charles VII, had driven the English out of all but Calais. He owed that reversal, in no small measure, to the lightning bolt morale Joan had supplied in 1429. To clear the stain of heresy that still clung to his own legitimacy through abandoning Joan, Charles petitioned Rome for a retrial. Pope Calixtus III appointed a commission of theologians and canon lawyers who convened in Rouen, the very city that had witnessed her death. Over 6 months, they examined parchment stacks of the 1431 proceedings, re-interviewed 115 witnesses, villagers from Domremy, soldiers from Orléans, even the executioner's assistant, and compared every article of the old indictment to orthodox doctrine. On the 7th of July 1456, the judges pronounced the verdict Coram Deo Veritate Vacua, empty of truth before God. Joan was declared innocent, and her trial branded a miscarriage of justice engineered by political enemies. In the cathedral choir at Rouen, a herald read the sentence while masons hammered a marble tablet into the wall. Martyr of the Kingdom! Through the Renaissance and the Bourbon era, Joan surfaced whenever France felt besieged. Valois kings staged pageants of the maid to legitimize their thrones. Revolutionary pamphleteers recast her as a proto-citizen soldier resisting foreign tyranny. Napoleon ordered a statue in the Tuileries Gardens as a spur to patriotic fervour. Each generation tailored her armour to its own anxieties, yet the core image remained. A fearless teenager wielding banner rather than bloodline. The church moved more slowly. By the 19th century, Catholics saw in Joan a ready counter-symbol to secular republicanism. After meticulous scrutiny of miracles attributed to her intercession, Pope Pius VI declared her blessed in 1909. World War I turned the final key. French soldiers at the Marne marched with her likeness on pocket medallions, and even cynical Poilus wrote home that La Pucelle fights in the trenches. In 1920, 2 years after the armistice, Pope Benedict XV canonized her. Saint Joan of Arc, feast day 30th May, patron of France, soldiers and, aptly, people mocked for their piety. Military academies still analyze her Orléans tactics for lessons in morale and aggressive timing. Psychologists debate the neurological or cultural roots of her voices. Gender scholars point to her adoption of male dress as an early case of strategic cross-presentation. Perhaps the richest trove for historians is the trial transcript itself, 700 pages of verbatim question and answer preserved in the dry ink of 15th century clerks. Few medieval women speak to us in their own cadence, fewer still who were not nobility or royalty. But Joan does so sharply, with intelligence and conviction, parrying, praying, refusing to betray her private revelations. Her cultural afterlife is dizzying. Shakespeare borrowed her for Henry VI, Voltaire satirized her, Mark Twain defended her with surprising reverence, George Bernard Shaw turned her into a modern conscience, and filmmakers from Dreyer to Besson have recreated the girl in armour with ever-new visual vocabularies. Across 6 centuries, Joan of Arc endures as proof that conviction, however one explains its source, can flip the tables of history, and that a single voice, whether saintly or stubborn, can echo far beyond the flames meant to silence it. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.